Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The UN at 75, a discussion with previous Israeli ambassadors to the United Nations. Here's Dan Mariashin, CEO of B'nai B'rith International.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm Dan Mariashin, CEO of B'nai B'rith. Thank you for joining us today. Well, this is truly something special. B'nai B'rith has always had a very special interest in the United Nations. It was present at the founding of the UN in San Francisco in 1945, and we received our first NGO, non-governmental organization credentials in 1947 at the UN, and then in 1960 opened the first full-time office on United Nations affairs in the Jewish community. We're represented at UNESCO in Paris and at the Human Rights Council in Geneva and in other places in the UN system. And so I'm honored today to be joined by four former Israeli permanent representatives to the United Nations: Ambassador Yehuda Lancry, Ambassador Dan Gillerman, Ambassador Gabriela Shalev, and Ambassador Ron Prosor. We want to thank the B'nai B'rith Office of UN Affairs and the B'nai B'rith World Center in Jerusalem for making this panel possible and for their work in advocating always for a strong and secure Israel. Well, as always happens in representing Israel, all of our guests have had to navigate persistent challenges and complicated situations at the UN. Today, I'll ask each to share their accomplishments and elaborate on some of their key experiences while representing Israel at the UN. Our larger panel discussion will focus on the UN's relationship with Israel and prospects for international cooperation as the UN marks its 75th anniversary this year. Ambassador Yehuda Lancry was Israel's 12th permanent representative to the UN, holding the position from 1999 to 2002. Originally from Morocco, Ambassador Lancry made Aliyah to Israel in 1965. Prior to his UN role, he served as Israel's ambassador to France and as a member of Knesset. He currently serves as a board member of Vital Capital, a private equity fund focused on sub-Saharan Africa. Ambassador Dan Gillerman was Israel's 13th permanent representative to the UN, serving from 2002 to 2008. During his tenure in 2005, Ambassador Gillerman was elected vice president of the UN General Assembly, the first Israeli to hold that position since Abba Eban in 1952. Today, Ambassador Gillerman is senior advisor to the Blackstone Group and chairman and CEO of Gillerman Global, a global consulting firm. Ambassador Gabriela Shalev served as Israel's 14th permanent representative to the UN from 2008 to 2010, the first woman in Israel to hold this position. A lawyer and jurist by background, Ambassador Shalev is currently a senior faculty member at Ono Academic College. She's also considered a leading expert on contract law. Ambassador Ron Prosor served as Israel's 16th permanent representative to the UN from 2011 to 2015. He also served as Ambassador of Israel to the United Kingdom, now head of the Abba Eban Institute of International Diplomacy at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. In total, Ambassador Prozzor spent 3 decades with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, developing an international reputation as one of Israel's most distinguished diplomats. Welcome, everyone. Well, thank you to each for being with us as we mark 75 years of the UN. We really appreciate your being here. In the first round of questions, we will begin chronologically based on your years at the UN. So let's begin with Ambassador Lancry. You served at the UN during the Camp David Summit, which was called by President Clinton. What was the reaction within the UN at the time amongst your colleagues regarding those efforts at peacemaking?
Allow me, Dan, at the outset, to thank you for the invitation to join this discussion and to avail myself, that is a UN language, of this rare and precious opportunity to express my gratitude and my deep appreciation for your organization and its working relation with the United Nations, a durable one in defense of the core values, the universal core values, the Jewish values, and of course in defense of the state of Israel. I came to the United Nations in a year which was a promising year at the political level in the international arena for Israel. As we remember, Ehud Barak, who served as prime minister, initiated some courageous steps. The exit or withdrawal of Israel from South Lebanon, who gave quite a very positive resonance to Israel in the United Nations. Then the peace vision, the global peace vision of Ehud Barak, which was well received by the United Nations. And I remember that on July 2000, just before the summit of Camp David, when Barak came with some 148 head of states, he was welcomed even by personalities, statesmen that were not in open and good relations with Israel. Fidel Castro was one of them. He praised his courageous decision to go forward with the peace process. I remember standing just after the Pakistani ambassador then, with his president, Pervez Musharraf. He turned to me and asked me, can we have handshakes between the president and the prime minister? Barak, of course, did so very willingly. And he also got the appreciation of Pervez Musharraf. This tells you that the atmosphere was rather a good one, a positive one for Israel. So in Camp David, the expectations were very, very high. We really believed that we are going to break through in the peace process with the Palestinians, but unfortunately, it turned out to be a kind of failure. Now we can read about this failure by the actors of the summit, Barak himself, and others in the American side. But in the UN, there was an expectation of some great event that is going to take place, to occur in the Middle East. And this optimism was not, at the end of the day, so justified.
The Camp David failure led ultimately to problems in with Israel's Operation Defensive Shield. What were the repercussions at the UN regarding that?
I think that the Operation Defensive Shield came a little bit later. It was well after the outbreak of the Second Intifada, under Ariel Sharon as Prime Minister, and after the Passover bombings in March 2002, Sharon initiated the defensive shield. We went through from the very beginning of the Intifada, 28th of September 2000, until the end of my mission, and I think, of course, the beginning of the task of Ambassador Gillerman for a while. We went through a series of meetings of the Security Council and a diplomatic onslaught on Israel. The atmosphere was very tense. We tried to reduce the damage. And of course, we could count on our friends, the United States of America. In the General Assembly, it does not work, but in the Security Council, we are well protected by the USA.
The notoriously anti-Semitic UN Durban conference, the conference on racism, happened just days before 9/11. Can you share what you think are what were the long-term implications of that conference at the UN and beyond, particularly on issues relating to anti-Semitism? Because we still look back to that conference as really beginning the explosion of global anti-Semitism. It's as if Durban gave a special seal of approval to that kind of activity.
This was a big disappointment for those who believe that now that we are advancing in terms of peace, negotiating with the Palestinians, maybe the anti-Semitism will not take place so vigorously in different arenas. But Durban was really a harsh setback. And I know that Secretary General Kofi Annan, he wrote about that in his book, was himself very disappointed by the way the Durban Conference, which was supposed to be a conference against racism, focused on Israel, singled out Israel and condemned Israel by all means. So we felt frustrated. Speaking about frustrations, that was one of the biggest frustrations that we felt in the United Nations. Although the UN in New York was not directly connected to the Durban Conference, it was through our representative in Geneva, mission in Geneva, that Durban was managed. But we were part of this, of course.
Well, just one more question about your service in New York. The city experienced the horrific September 11th tragedy. And what were your recollections of the atmosphere at the time in the halls of the UN?
I was in Montreal the same day. I was invited a few days ago before the horrific event to appear before the Jewish community of Montreal. As you know, they are Francophone, and I'm also close to this nature. And the first evening was okay. It was September 10th. The day tomorrow, at the morning, while speaking in English for the Vitso group of the women of Montreal, someone came, disrupted the whole lecture, and told me to come and to see what's happening in the news. Of course, I was horrified by what happened, and the instructions were that I have to stick to my venue in Montreal. There were more bodyguards, and during 5 or 6 days, I was there. I can't return back to New York. I had to, because the roads were blocked, and even the United Nations headquarters were not open. After grosso modo a week, I was able to be back at home, to go to the United Nations, and to start evaluating the situation with other colleagues. I do remember the great embarrassment of the Arab ambassadors, because a meeting of the General Assembly was convened, and they were really on the defensive. The news were given in details. Everyone knew that Egyptians were there, that Saudi Arab were there, citizens of these countries. And I remember being approached by then the ambassador of Egypt, Ahmed Abou Reit, who currently serves as the Secretary General of the Arab League, and asked me about my speech. I said that I am going to speak, of course, against terrorism and to express our solidarity and sympathy and so on to the United States. He told me, look, Yehuda, I think that is a good occasion for you to help us. I said, in what sense? He suggested that I just insert a few sentences of, general perception of a future of better harmony and coexistence between Israel and the neighbors of Israel in the Middle East, just to give a sense of the world is still here. We are continuing to work. We will overcome this horrific event. I did so generously because I felt that he was really in a kind of misery that I decided to help him in such a way.
Thank you. Ambassador Gillerman, these questions are for you. During your time in New York, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, took over the Palestinian leadership following the death of Yasser Arafat. Did you notice any significant changes in the direction of the Palestinians at the UN that accompanied this transition from Arafat to Abu Mazen?
No, first of all, Dan, let me also express my gratitude for this great initiative and my appreciation for B'nai B'rith, who I worked very closely with also when I was in New York, and you're truly one of the stalwarts of the international relations of the Jewish world, and have always shown great interest and had amazing impact also on our work at the UN. And I'm very proud to share this panel with my distinguished colleagues, and thank you for the opportunity. As far as a change in the Palestinian attitude after the death of Yasser Arafat and the emergence of Mahmoud Abbas, there wasn't really any big change. The Palestinian representative, some people call him ambassador, but Palestine is still not a member of the UN, was actually a very, very nice gentleman who was really American. He lived in Orlando, had an American passport. Riyad Mansour, very nice gentleman. I'm sure that also my colleagues, I think he probably served with Yehuda, he served definitely with Gabi and with Ron, and I think he's still serving, will be serving with Gilad Erdan and probably a few future Israeli ambassadors. He's a veteran of the UN. He's a gentleman. He's a very nice person, personally. I think he's a nephew or a cousin of Arafat, actually. And his views, neither his personal views nor the views of the Palestinians have changed. We did, however, I must say, have a very cordial relationship. He even came to my home for my farewell party, which was probably just to make sure I'm actually leaving. But as far as the Palestinian attitude, there wasn't really any great change from the time of Arafat to the emergence of Mahmoud Abbas.
Can you speak about your experience during the conflict in Lebanon in 2006? Now, since then, Hezbollah's role in Lebanon, backed by Iran, has just grown exponentially. We're seeing it right now playing out before our eyes in Lebanon. And yet, once again, UN peacekeeping efforts intended to keep arms out of the hands of Hezbollah have failed over and over. Why is it that the international community simply turns a blind eye to this? And we're talking now specifically about Lebanon.
Well, first of all, talking about Lebanon, I'm sure that my colleagues share my feelings about the horrible tragedy that happened in Beirut, and we extend our sympathy to the Lebanese people, to the obviously not to Hezbollah or to the other extremists, but it's a horrible, horrible tragedy. And Lebanon is a tragedy. Lebanon is a tragedy. Beirut is a tragic place. And as far as Lebanon is concerned, I think that the UN has also been somewhat tragic. I was at the UN during the Second Lebanon War. I took part in the negotiations to get to Resolution 1701, which actually ended the Second Lebanon War. And the good side of it, and this is something I think we have to acknowledge, and I think it is one of the accomplishments of Prime Minister Olmert, is that since then, for nearly 15 years, the northern border of Israel has been relatively quiet. There have been some incidents, but nothing like the violence which we experienced there before. This is certainly not due to the presence of UNIFIL. It is not due to the United Nations, but we have to give credit where credit's due, and the resolution itself was actually adopted by the Security Council of the United Nations. As far as the incidents in Lebanon and the strengthening of Hezbollah and the storage of tens of thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of missiles which are directed at every spot of Israel, this is something which the international community, I think in general, and certainly the United Nations, have disregarded. And I think it's a huge mistake, because we do have on our northern border an immediate and very, very real danger and a powder keg that could emerge any day. But I want to point out again that at the end of the day, the resolution which did bring an end to this conflict and to the Second Lebanon War was reached at the United Nations, where, by the way, the French were the ones who were representing the interests of Lebanon, and the Americans, to a great extent, were the ones representing the interests of Israel. And I must say, at this junction, although it may not be popular among some viewers, a person who played a very vital role in getting the resolution which Israel accepted in the end and took care of the interests of Israel was actually Ambassador John Bolton, who served with me at that time at the United Nations. I also, this was in 2006. In 2005, we did have an occasion which I think was probably the largest summit of the UN ever. It marked the 60th anniversary of the United Nations. There were 177 world leaders, ranging from Bush and to Putin, from Chavez to Ahmadinejad. And the amazing thing, and this is something I will never forget, was that the most popular, the most sought after, the most respected world leader at that summit was actually Arik Sharon, who was then Prime Minister. And that very hated leader internationally, who was described as a demon just not long before that, was probably the superstar of that mega production, because he did come to New York very soon after this engagement. And that was an amazing experience to witness and to be part of. Following that, of course, soon after he had the stroke and Ehud Olmert took over, and we then had the Annapolis Conference, which took place in November of 2007. And again, there were great hopes and great disappointments, like with everything we experienced at the UN, although there were also some accomplishments, which hopefully I'll refer to when you ask me about them.
And finally, what was your assessment of Ban Ki-moon as he began his term as UN Secretary General? Any noticeable differences between him and his predecessor, Kofi Annan?
Well, there's a big difference. I had the pleasure, the honor, and the opportunity to serve with both Kofi Annan, to whom I presented my credentials, and with Ban Ki-moon. Kofi Annan, he may not be the most popular Secretary General, and certainly not the most beloved one in Israel, but Kofi Annan was certainly a leader, a man of charisma, of great leadership, and I think he will be remembered as a very significant Secretary General. Ban Ki-moon, who was actually a good friend of Israel before becoming Secretary General, he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Korea, visited Israel, expressed great love, I would say even, but certainly respect for Israel. When he took over as Secretary General, I think the fact that he was a nice guy was an impediment. You cannot be a nice guy in that glass building on First Avenue, and you can certainly not please everybody. And I think that the big problem with Ban Ki-moon, who I liked and had a very good personal relationship was that he did try to please everybody. And when you have 193 customers, clients, who are so different, democracies, totalitarian regimes, terrorist countries, small countries, large countries, you know, there's no way countries with great values and countries without any values or morality, you cannot please everybody. And I think that Ban Ki-moon did try to please many people most of the time. And therefore, I think that if you compare him to Kofi Annan, Kofi Annan will, you know, the late Kofi Annan, I think will be remembered as a greater Secretary General who had much more impact on both on the UN and on the world.
Thank you. Ambassador Shalev, your U.S. counterpart for part of your service in New York was Ambassador Susan Rice, who was on the shortest list to be Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden's vice president. What was that relationship like, and how did you work together on issues of concern for Israel at the UN?
Thank you, Dan. Like my colleagues here, I want to thank you and Bnei Brit for convening this Zoom meeting, for bringing us together, sharing our feelings, experience, opportunities, and mainly maybe disappointments or frustrations. It's interesting that until yesterday, this great friend of mine, Dr. Susan Rice, was one heartbeat away from presidency. But let me say that since she was appointed, me being a woman of a different age, different place, we became, as she described in this book, which she wrote and published last year, she describes us as sisters fighting in the trenches for Israel, and of course for the United States. We shared friendship, but much more than that. She was very helpful through her tenure and the mission that she was heading. We shared views, sometimes different opinions, but I felt that the friendship that was between us helped a lot to the relationship between the new administration, Obama, and the new government, that Likud and Netanyahu, and the new prime minister and the new foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman, were kind of trying to form some kind of relationship, a new relationship between the new president and the new government in Israel, which all happened at the same time. And when she was appointed as a very close friend of President Barack Obama, I think one of the first ambassadors that she visited cordially was the Israeli ambassador. And since then, we've became, and we still are, great friends. And I think this friendship, first of all, helped me as a woman in a very, how shall I say, a place that is mainly with male ambassadors, but also in spite of the difference in age, generation, upbringing, I think this relationship personally helped me to fight the war that we all fight inside the United Nations, the Security Council, and for Israel.
Well, your background before becoming Israel's UN ambassador was in law and academia. How did that experience and your expertise help you during your posting in New York, especially when dealing with, for example, the Mavi Marmara incident with Turkey, the Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. How did that help you navigate the diplomatic process at the UN?
These are the two events that you mentioned. Chronologically, it happened the other way. I mean, just a couple of months after I was appointed, the Cast Lead operation took place. It was right after Christmas 2009. And in July 2010 was the event of the Mavi Marmara. So between those two and Iran, Ahmadinejad was there at the first assembly, which was to me shocking. You are right. I was not prepared for the challenges that occurred at my tenure. I thought when I was appointed that I'm going to represent Israel that we all know and love, Israel beyond the conflict, because that was a different time. There were negotiations taking place. As Danny mentioned, Dan Gillerman, it was after the disengagement, and Israel was not, as it was at my time later on, the bad boy, the enfant terrible of the whole world. So in a way, coming from the academia, where we look at the truth, I found the double speech at the UN frustrating. And I was appointed as out of the legal profession, but my expertise is private law, not constitutional law. But I think that the world of the law is something that the United Nations is very accustomed to. You know, all the meetings and the protocols. So in a way, my legal background was not an obstacle, but I was never a politician, so I was not a political appointment. I was never part of the diplomatic corps, so I was not sure how to handle myself. And I know that many other diplomats coming from all over the world, they are much more accustomed to what they think that ambassadors are doing, like going to cocktails from one cocktail to the other. This is maybe true about the ambassador representing Denmark or other countries at the UN. This is not true about myself and my esteemed colleagues. To represent Israel at the UN is hard labor. I mean, it's day and night, it's meetings of the Security Council, and to stand at the General Assembly, and in a way, feeling loneliness. And you mentioned Susan Rice, but again, it's not Susan Rice, it's the United States that always stands there with us. It doesn't matter if it's this president or the other president, but we have the big friend, and Danny mentioned Ban Ki-moon, who also had very good relationship with him. He admired Obama, that I remember, because everything that he had to decide, he looked, what does the American president say about this issue or the other issue? So in a way, it was very helpful to have the United States in the Security Council supporting us always, and to have the American ambassador as a friend, and as she said, as a sister of mine, a younger sister.
Well, you have the distinction of being Israel's first female ambassador to the UN. What advice would you give to young Israeli women who would like to serve their country in the field of diplomacy?
First of all, believe in yourselves. Dan, this is a good question, especially now. I'll just give you an anecdote. Last week, there was a meeting of the committee at the Knesset, which deals with the fact that it was in the committee that about women's rights. dealing with the fact that there's not even one woman in what we formed in Israel as the Corona Cabinet, which is composed of ministers, and there's not even one woman. At the committee, which is headed by a man, there were only women. So I think if a young woman would ask me, first of all, you need a lot of support, and you need people to pave the way and believe in yourself. And I know that there are some young diplomats that look up to this challenging and important position, as many other embassies or ambassadors all over the world. And I think the fact that I was elected as a woman and appointed as a woman, the idea was, in a way, to change the image of Israel as a machoistic state, which it is not, but you know, a state that is governed by generals and is dealing only with the conflict in the Middle East. And I was hoping, and I still hope, that we can show the other kind or the other face of Israel.
Thank you. Ambassador Prozzor, your time in New York also overlapped with that of Susan Rice, and her successor was Samantha Power. Tell us about working with those two very high-profile American diplomats.
First of all, I'll tell you with pleasure, but when I see Gabi, Yehuda, and Danny, look, we all have, we have our stories. At the bottom line, this is being on the front line of Israel's, battlefield, because you sit there in this vantage point called the United Nations, which are not united on anything, maybe against Israel. And bottom line, what really hit me very strongly after 30 years then was the fact that I visited New York many times. I was Director General when Danny was ambassador many times, but only when I got to the United Nations. What I can tell you is that after 30 years, and being ambassador to the United Kingdom was a good preparation. By the way, the Queen is still not recovered from my departure. She's moving in an uncontrollable way, saying to Charles, not this year's Charles. I was shocked. I was shocked to say, wow, this can't be happening, okay? And I think the triple standards that Israel has at the United Nations, there's one standard for democracies, another standard for dictatorships, and a special standard for Israel, which is unattainable. And you asked me about Susan Rice. I nearly had Susan Rice for 2 years, and then Samantha for 2 and something years. Very different, but like Gabi said, I didn't have a sisterhood with Susan, but I know from Susan that she really, her and Gabi had a very good relationship. But bottom line, Israel, I want to put one point on this, okay? I was shocked, and I'm still shocked at the Europeans, okay? The Europeans, this is absolutely unbelievable. It has nothing to do with what we do or we do not do. The voting patterns at the United Nations, I think most of the citizens have no clue. World Health Organization, 2016, 2019 decides to denounce one country on creating health hazards in the Middle East. And do they go for Syria? No. Do they go for Yemen? No. Do you go for no? Israel. And who votes for it? France, La Grande République, Yehuda. Sweden, Switzerland, Spain. And by the way, great changes in May. Germany decided to abstain. I mean, what did you drink? What schnapps did you drink out there? And this is, one out of many in the sense where you say, oh, wow, wow. So now back to this. Look, we all have our experiences, and, I can go down and then, when I was thinking about this, we all, I was in Protective Edge, so I would connect to basically allowing Israel to be able to do what it wanted to do with, in essence, nearly 2 months, having the Security Council not do anything, not move against Israel. Everyone here on the panel knows what it means. Day and night work under the radar screen with an amazing team that is paid in a way that, you know, they barely make the cut to finish the month. So in the sense, from my perspective, that I was really shocked, and I think every American ambassador, when it comes to the UN, and it doesn't make a difference from what political angle, basically says, wow, this can't be happening. So I think Susan saw the same thing, Samantha, and it's really, it's unbelievable here. And the outing then that you saw, I think, by Nikki Haley, she was the one that not just saw it, but basically came out and said, you know, this can't be happening.
Well, speaking of the Europeans, Israel was at the forefront of arguing that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, between Iran and the major powers would not put Iran off track from its objective of developing nuclear weapons. An effort that you led at the UN when the JCPOA was announced. Since then, the US has withdrawn from the JCPOA, while many in the international community still cling to it in one way or another. Notwithstanding what some may say, do you think, based on what you've seen at the UN, do you think that the international community is serious about addressing Iran's objectives and actually stopping the Iranians from achieving nuclear capability?
So Dan, you know that I also dealt with it when I was in Washington. This was my fight. Before that, one sentence on something which is quite clear. When I was in Washington, I had the North Korean file. It was Clinton administration, okay? So Clinton, Bush, Obama, and when it came to Trump, in essence, this is an arms control regime that not only didn't function, but you had an amazing array of administrations trying to do different things with North Korea with zero results. At the end of the day, you know, every time they crossed the red line, they said, yes, it's 6 men. Okay. So it's Wendy Sherman doing the negotiations also in North Korea. Jump forward on the issue of Iran. Factually, I'm not talking about different inclinations. Factually, when the US was about to sign the agreement the first time round, the Kerry team, the Brits came over and said, no, this is not good enough. A couple of things missing here. Went back to the Iranians, got a better deal. When they were about to sign again, the French came back. Said, hey, not enough. And it went back to Iran and got a better deal. Bottom line, it's very clear, or should be clear today, not then. The Iranians are breaching the agreement. They're crossing the red lines. All those stories in the Majlis, in the parliament, okay, here are more pragmatic or moderate people going in. Nothing happens. The Iranians are undermining everyone in the region. The Iranians, and look at what they're doing, very few people know that diplomatic ties were cut between Morocco and Iran. Why? Because he's trying to undermine Mohammed VI in Morocco. Bottom line, when you look at the Iranians' behavior patterns, okay, beyond the issue of nuclear weapons, missiles, and in essence, you know, it's like the icing in the cake. This regime, you know, I'm surprised that anyone thinks that a different approach on Iran now is going to turn the Iranians into Swedes.
But just one more question before we make another quick go around the table. You mentioned Operation Protective Edge during your tenure, also Operation Pillar of Defense. The diplomatic fallout for Israel at the UN, I mean, all that we know about how Hamas would position its weapons inside UNRWA schools or between houses. I mean, all of that. When you went off the floor of the General Assembly and you went into the corridors, what were you saying? What were your colleagues saying to you? They were seeing the same thing. I mean, we certainly didn't have any inside information. We saw what we know what we saw on TV. What were they saying off the floor of the General Assembly? Okay,
it's a wonderful question, Dan, because everyone encountered, all my colleagues here, what you see above the radar screen and what you see under the radar screen. But what is important is what, at the end of the day, they say, okay? They say publicly. They know the truth. Come on. I mean, look, they don't know what's happening. Both the Egyptians, the Jordanians, they know exactly what's happening on the ground. The bottom line is what they say and what they pass as resolutions, because those resolutions at the end of the day create structures there. And those structures stay behind. And I can tell you very, very well, you know, and all those structures, at the end of the day, it creates precedents, and those precedents is what is called agreed language at the UN. I can see all my colleagues smiling. Agreed language, oh my God. The minute you have an agreed language to take this out, it's a catastrophe. So the bottom line here is that we have to understand that the structures are done in the committees in an incremental way through the years, and it creates a huge burden on the state of Israel. And this is certainly a battlefield. We see it with the ICC, and we see it what's happening in The Hague. And by the way, peacekeeping forces, you know, in essence, when you see them operate, they're a joke then. You know, they're a joke in the sense, look at UNDOF, 1974, Israel, Syria. What they did in the next 30 years was the most dramatic thing, that they had to save a cow or a goat from a barbed wire on the Golan. The minute they started shooting, well, UNDOF forces wanted out. Who wanted out? First, the Austrians. They wanted to go back to Vienna to drink a melange and eat a Zacherto. Said, hey, where are you going? Bottom line, they went after 30 days, and we all stayed in suspense there, to wait for the force from Fiji to come and save us on the Golan Heights after 3 months. So bottom line, Israel, when you look at it from this angle at the UN, we have to rely on ourselves. We have to create those coalitions. But what I saw that really amazed me, except for the United States of America, certain countries like Germany and others, my God, the problem is not with the bad guys. It's the so-called like-minded countries. And this is something that we all should take home.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Prosor. We're going to go around the table again. We'll do what we call here a lightning round. And I've got two questions, which I will ask each of you, and we'll throw the questions out now, and then we'll go to Ambassador Lancry. First is the UN is observing its 75th year. What do you see going forward for the United Nations and Israel's place in the UN? Because really, during the time of, let's say, from Ambassador Lancry to the present, for example, the number of countries that have established or reestablished relations with Israel and the international community has grown. So what is the future of the UN and Israel's place in it? And the second question, I have to ask this one. You have a new ambassador coming to the UN, Gilad Erdan. What advice will you be giving to Israel's new permanent representative? So we'll start first with Ambassador Lancry.
Okay, let me just say 2-3 words about the question of achievements and frustrations very rapidly. I think that I felt in the United Nations the positive impact of Israel's withdrawal in Lebanon. It made good to Israel in the UN. Also the peace vision, the attempt of Ehud Barak, it softened the relation toward Israel. And we were lucky to have with us, we spoke about ambassadors, a great one, really great one, Richard Holbrooke, who was a driving force in, and your organization also contributed in the admittance of Israel to the real group. I'm not the one who is going to claim the credit for himself, but Holbrooke did a wonderful job. He started the whole process with my predecessor, Dori Gold, and asked me during our first meeting to put all my energy in order to help him with Israel in the world. So Kofi Annan, and Dan Gillerman spoke rightly about Kofi Annan. He's really a great leader, a spiritual man, a man of wisdom and vision, and his imprint in the United Nations will live for a long time. Kofi Annan also advocated the inclusion of Israel to the WEOG. So it gave us really a dimension of a new visibility and a new eligibility. Both Ambassador Gillerman and Ron Prosor were elected as vice president of the General Assembly. And we have score of positions that we can fill. So these were, I would say, the events of achievements of Israel that I felt during my tenure. Frustration, we had it. We had it during the whole Intifada with the so-called Jenin massacre and other accusations, and you could feel the diplomatic onslaught on Israel. Now, to speak about the future of the United Nations, I have every respect for Ban Ki-moon and Antonio Guterres, but I think that the guidelines are in this book of Kofi Annan. I don't know if you read it, if my colleagues read it, but the whole philosophy of Kofi Annan, which starts with the Charter of the United Nations. We the people. The whole philosophy says, let us give the focus to the peoples and not only to the member states. And what you have now, which is developing the rule of law, democracy, human rights, conflict prevention, environment, I think that these are the great domains, the great realms where the UN will be involved. If you follow the Millennium Development Goals, you have also a great chapter to fulfill. So I think that the major problem, as we see it right now around the coronavirus crisis, is a discordant Security Council. We saw that during the Syrian crisis, this 14 veto of Russia, the opposition of China to take action, the failure in Darfur, which was all the more sharp and bitter because it came after the resolution of the responsibility to protect, also inspired by Kofi Annan. I think that if the Security Council can change its modalities and cannot unite, this will paralyze the whole institution. I have in mind, speaking about failures and successes of the United Nations, what one of the colleagues, a French colleague, he was my colleague during a few months, but then served with Ambassador Gillerman. Jean-Marc de Sablière was a French permanent representative. He had some 40 years that he dedicated around the UN business and published a book recently. And in this book, he gives an example of United Security Council when the Security Council took action in order to liberate Kuwait from the Iraqi invasion. And he stressed the fact that the American-led coalition by George Bush, the father, who served before that, prior to the presidency, as an ambassador, US ambassador to the UN, and understood very well how to work with the Security Council, the Security Council who held no less than 70 meetings between August 1990 to 1991, February 1991, in fact applied perfectly the articles of the Charter of the United Nations and got really the objective that was the important one for the international community. So I believe that certain reforms have to occur inside the Security Council, of course, to enlarge it to other emerging powers, Japan, Germany, and others, India. And maybe the General Assembly also should be the objective of some modifications, some amendments, in order to have a more logic world institution dedicated to the service of the peoples and not only to the rogue states and dictators.
Thank you. Ambassador Gillerman.
Well, you know, listening to my colleagues and especially to the frustration of Ron Prosor, who I know is an incurable optimist, I obviously share the frustration about the UN being a citadel of hypocrisy and, as Ron said, not only double but triple standards. And we've all shared those frustrations. But Yehuda Lancry mentioned Ambassador Holbrooke, Dick Holbrooke. Dick Holbrooke did not serve with me. I actually had the pleasure of serving with 4 American ambassadors in the 6 years that I was there. I served with John Negroponte, Jack Danforth, John Bolton, and Chalmei Khalizad, which I don't think is a great compliment to American foreign policy. I know that, you know, even some secretaries of state think that maybe the tenure of an American ambassador should be mandated to be 4 years at least, because at the UN, it's a lot about learning the rules, learning the language, getting to know the people. But in any case, Dick Holbrooke was to a great extent my mentor. We had lunch every few weeks, and I remember expressing my great frustration about the UN after some diplomatic debacle. And Dick said to me, he said, "Look, Dan, you have to remember that the UN is a building on First Avenue. At the end of the day, it's only as good as its tenants. And its tenants are the world we live in. So to blame the UN for a diplomatic debacle is like blaming Madison Square Garden when the Knicks don't perform well, which they haven't for the last 10 years. So I'm not underestimating the importance or the frustration that we've all witnessed at the UN. But at the end of the day, this is the world we live in. And much of the blame is with the world. The UN has certain powers, it has a certain influence, it's the parliament of the world, but the world we live in is the world which is divided into those 3 hypocrisies, including, you know, the non-aligned nations. Daniel Patrick Moynihan is famous for passing by the hall where the members of the non-aligned countries met, and in a very non-diplomatic way, saying to them, what the, and I won't say the F word, are you non-aligned about? So it's very frustrating, but at the same time, I did discover in a very significant way that you can also, even when you represent Israel, achieve achievements at the UN. And I think my crowning achievement, not my, Israel's crowning achievement, and my great team, which was very small, but truly an A team of deputy ambassador and other diplomats, great people, including Danny Carmon and Gilad Cohen. Ron knows them all very well. We got the International Holocaust Resolution, Remembrance Resolution passed against all odds. And we did it by forming coalitions. We did it by mobilizing the Dutch, who were then the presidents of the European Union. of mobilizing maybe even the guilt feelings of the European countries. But at the end of the day, we passed a historic resolution which passed unanimously and created International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is actually marked, and if you can use the word, celebrated by not only the UN, but the world every year on January 27th, which is the day of the liberation of Auschwitz. So I would use that as one of my recommendations to the new ambassador, to Gilad Erdan. I've given him advice in private talks we had prior to his departure, and I shared with him many views and many different aspects, including, by the way, the aspect which was alluded to here of making the most of the opportunity to form relations, and informal relations, with ambassadors who represent countries that not only do not recognize us, but are even perceived as being hostile to us. But by engaging with them, creating a relationship of trust and respect, you can actually, at the end of the day, bring dividends to your country which far outweigh any vote at any UN forum. So my advice to Gilad, who comes with a wealth of experience, having served as minister in the Israeli government and a member of the cabinet, is don't apologize, don't be shy, walk the halls of the United Nations with your head held up high, as I did, because you represent a country that is far better than most other member states of the United Nations. And by forming coalitions and by standing up for Israel and doing the right thing, you can achieve achievements and make your mark even at that very, very difficult and citadel of hypocrisy on First Avenue. So I wish him luck, and I'm sure that with the help of organizations like Bnei B'rith, he will also succeed.
Well, thank you. Ambassador Shalev.
I fully agree that the UN is not better than all the states that are represented in it. And it's not a wonderful world. I think nowadays, the UN is even facing the crisis of the whole world, the corona crisis. And the world is now, as we speak, is moving from globalization and internationalization to a lack of solidarity, and each state is concerned, like Trump said, America first, and it's the same that we hear in Europe and in many other countries. So this puts a different challenge and another crisis that the UN is also facing. It's a health crisis, an economic crisis, but mainly it's solidarity between people and peoples and states. And I think it's a great danger. The language of the United Nations, I learned that there is a difference between multi-relationship and bilateral relationship with countries. And Israel has many, many countries that are friends and cooperate on many, many levels. But when it comes, as was described here, when it comes to the halls of the United Nations and to the Security Council and to the General Assembly, we hear a different speech. And I think it's very important to realize that there's a lot to do in the United Nations regarding the relationship with countries and with the United Nations itself. I want to remind us that 75 years ago, when the UN was established, the United Nations, they had shared the same kind of, I would say, slogan that we at the State of Israel embraced, which is never again. The wars, the Holocaust, the awful things that happened in the 20th century. And I'm afraid that the UN is not up to facing all these challenges. I can sum it up by saying that the UN is imperfect, but indispensable. I know that there were voices in the United States, in Israel, to disengage, to leave the UN, because the UN is against Israel, and as I think it was McCain in his campaign, and also Trump, that said that the UN is always against America and Israel. I think the advice that Danny gave to Gilad Erdan, and we all wish him luck, because as they used to say, your success is our success, is to stand up for Israel and show the real beautiful Israel that is dealing with technology and high tech and medicine, state of the art, and the people of Israel that wish to live in a better world with our neighbors and with the whole world. So thank you for the opportunity to share our views.
Thank you. Ambassador Prozzor.
I want to take it from where Gabi left. Huge challenges for the UN, huge challenges for multilateral structures, European Union, UN, the whole idea that we were taught for years, globalization, basically going back, and the COVID-19 here shows that the end of the day, when push comes to shove, countries look at themselves, their own citizens. If you're a Spaniard or an Italian, you say, what the hell did the EU do for me? And the same thing at the UN. If you look at it, during the Ebola crisis, UN was very effective because it was focused regionally on West Africa. The UN now, COVID, zero. Why zero? Because of what happens in the Security Council between China and the US, World Health Organization. Bottom line, huge challenges on those structures. Now, the structures are, you're asking me about 75 years of the UN, started with huge legitimacy, and it's eroding. It's eroding because of the tenets at the UN. Yeah, out of 193 member states, only 89 are democracies. It has an effect on what happens at the organizations. And in essence here, after 75 years, you have countries sitting and asking themselves, like India or Brazil, this is, the Security Council is a picture of 1945, the strategic alliances. I think, again, that Gabi was absolutely right. The UN does good stuff, both in disabilities, MDGs, SDGs, food security, a lot of issues that deal with gender, but the bottom line, this cannot continue this way on no merit. Things here are being done through politics and petty politics. And at the end of the day, when I look back and I want to, I can't miss this opportunity because Yehuda mentioned it. He's absolutely right. Yehuda and David Levy. David Levy is responsible for the fact that Israel went into a wheel because they also gave us, 3 years of not to enter this. And by creating, and here is a good angle here, we need Bnei Brit then. We need Bnei Brit to enlarge the Bnei Brit that we have at the United Nations. And I think that Gilad Erdan at the end of the day has to, and I talked and sat with him like everyone else, bottom line, create something that would show the world what Israel does, how Israel copes in this region. And again, really stand up. And when I want to use another thing that is a bit problematic for us Israelis, the issue of national pride. We always tend to think that national pride is something for the Arab world. This is something which is a bit more, No, national pride is absolutely important and plays a role especially in a place like the United Nations. If we don't respect ourselves, we cannot basically ask others to respect us. And this is something which is crucial. I want to say that there's a lot of things that all of us did at the UN. I look at the fact that Rita appeared in singing, both in Farsi and in Hebrew, in the General Assembly. as something that basically I'm sure that Iranians until today are trying to find out, what the hell happened there. So to show what Israel is all about, also from a different angle. And yes, we can all be very, very proud of what this country is doing and presenting.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Prozzor. Just one note about Ambassador Lancry mentioning and Ambassador Gillerman mentioning Richard Holbrooke. I remember when David Levy was foreign minister at the time, came to the UN to meet with Holbrooke. It was about WEOG. WEOG is the Western European and Others group at the United Nations. Israel could not get in to that grouping, and ultimately Holbrooke was able to move this forward. And after David Levy and Holbrooke had their private meeting in the Waldorf Towers, they came down and there was a lunch for representatives of Jewish organizations to make this announcement. So there have been some important achievements, certainly a lot of contentiousness over the years. We talk about the 75th anniversary. The UN was born with such hope and such promise, really on the ashes of the Holocaust, the ashes of World War II. And who supported it? Yes, the new state of Israel supported it because of its ideals and mission, and Jewish organizations were very supportive. And then we've seen over the years how it has deteriorated. But because of people like yourselves, all of you, each of you, and the work that you've done, I can tell you that as supporters of Israel, certainly we are all in your debt for the work that each of you has done over the years. So I want to thank you for taking the time, each of you, to speak with us today. I want to thank Ambassadors Lancry, Gillerman, Shalev, and Prozzor for being with us and sharing their insights as the United Nations marks its 75th anniversary. And a recording of this conversation will be available on demand on the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel very shortly. I also want to thank each of you for joining us today. We have an international audience, and I hope that you will come back for future discussions. For my distinguished guests, I'm Dan Mariashin. Take care, continue to be well. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.